Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Productions. I'm Crown Gray's Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video is going to be our last video to do with alternative history. I know it's very sad. I know it's kind of coming to an end of an era. But yeah, this final video is going to be on what if the Stuarts never ruled England. Now, I just want to kind of have a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not too well at the moment. I had a bit of food poisoning the other day. And so if I look or sound terrible, apologies. Yeah, this is taking quite a lot of effort for me to try to do this video today. But yeah, and also as well, just to let people know that in future, the videos will be released on Sunday. I know a lot of people kind of very, messaging me saying, yo, when's the next video coming out? It's Sunday from now on, because that's when most people tend to watch my videos. So just a heads up for that. But anyway, now we're going to kind of dive into the kind of like history of this. And yeah, I hope that you really enjoy it. So first of all, I want you to picture that you're in Elizabethan England in 1603. William Shakespeare has made a series of very patriotic plays, such as Richard II, which came out in 1595, and then also Henry V, which came out in 1599. So at this point in time, English nationalism is really being formulated to a greater level than it ever has been before. People have a lot of pride in England. A few years before, you had the Spanish Armada in 1588, which England had overcome, and England was set on the path to being a great nation. However, a few years later, so imagine now it's 1606, and there ends up being a play that comes out by Shakespeare called Macbeth. And this is set in Scotland, and it's to do with Scottish kings, and it's to do with, witchcraft and all the rest of it. Now, the reason for this sudden shift is as a result of the ascendancy to the throne of James VI of Scotland, i.e. James I of England. So James I, he was one of the nephews of Elizabeth I, and how he ended up taking over the throne is not really how it ought to have been done. So what I mean by this is I want to give a big shout out to the YouTube channel Useful Charts, because they did a video a while ago, and it really pointed this thing out to me, which is part of the basis for why I did this video in the first place. Because with the will of Henry VIII, what he had said is that after he'd gone through all of his different children, so Edward the Seventh, Mary the First, and Elizabeth the First, what the line of succession should then do is then follow the lineage from his younger sister, Mary, as opposed to his older sister, Margaret, right? So Margaret ended up becoming the Queen of the Scots. But if you go basically through his younger sister, Mary's line, you end up with Edward Seymour succeeding Elizabeth I. So Edward Seymour, his great aunt was the famous Jane Seymour, who was the favourite of Henry VIII's 6 wives, right? So she is the one who gave birth to his only son and heir, who was Edward VII, right? So within this, you can see just how influential the Seymour family were at that time. And so if it had been a thing where it followed the line which Henry VIII had kind of set out, then Edward Seymour would have taken over. And then if one was to follow the line all the way down to the present day, one ends up with Theresa Freeman Grenfell as the current monarch of England, right? Assuming multiple different things, etc., because obviously so many different things kind of like come into play when we're looking at these kind of alternative histories, especially almost 400 years gap between them. But according to the lineage that actually kind of took place, that's what we're kind of running with. So the question that we're asking in this video is, how would this seemingly tiny change have transformed not just the fate of England, not just the fate of Scotland, but of much of the world as we know it today? That's what we're going to look into now. Now, the most obvious thing is that if there had been no Stuart dynasty ruling England, then the union between England and Scotland would probably never have happened. And the reason I say that with such certainty is that the Stuarts ruled England from 1603 until 1714. And it wasn't until the reign of the final Stuart monarch, so Queen Anne, it wasn't until then that the formal Act of Union were passed, right? So this is in 1707. So England and Scotland had a kind of dual monarchy, where like you had one monarch and they were ruling both parliaments. So you had the parliament in England and the parliament in Scotland, and yet it took 104 years of this kind of peculiar setup before there was the actual motion to kind of like put the two countries together formally. So this is something to really kind of bear in mind, yeah, of like just how, if it didn't happen at this exact time here, it was likely never to have happened. And if it was 104 years of the two dynasties being joined like this, and still it only just narrowly kind of ended up being passed, then we can be almost certain that England and Scotland would be separate entities today. So part of the reason why England and Scotland end up eventually joining together in the Act of Union 1707 was twofold. So first of all, you had the failure of the Darien scheme, which was basically the Scots' attempt to have a colonial empire. So they took what is now part of like Panama and stuff, right, from well, the people who run it at the time were the Spanish, and they wanted to set up the Panama Canal. This is like almost 200 years before the Panama Canal ends up being built by the Americans, but this is what the Scots had the plan for, right? But for various different reasons, you know, there's malaria, there's all these different tropical diseases, etc., etc. For many different reasons, the Darien scheme was a complete failure and it bankrupted the Scottish government. And on top of that, you're having the Aliens Act of 1705, which was passed by the English Parliament. Now, there are multiple different things within this, yeah, but part of it was the boycotting of half of Scotland's exports, yeah, by basically the English saying, we're not going to trade with Scotland anymore unless you agree to an Act of Union. So through strong arming and also through bribery, they end up basically getting it over the line in terms of getting the Scottish Parliament to consent to having one Parliament for Great Britain, and this would be based in London. So through this Act of Union, you end up having the Kingdom of Great Britain, and finally you end up having the Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and this is obviously how we have like the Union Jack today. So this would have obviously had a huge impact, yeah, on the Scottish nationalism, yeah, because Scotland would be distinct, it would be independent, and it would be seen as, you know, completely separate from England, yeah, had the two crowns never been mixed in the first place by James the First. And then, you know, probably I'd say more so, it would have had much more of an impact on English nationalism rather than Scottish nationalism, because the Scots have always retained their sense of national identity, whereas the English, up until very recent times, have been basically subsumed with this wider kind of British identity, right? So for instance, even if one was to look at the World Cup victory in 1966, you know, England ended up beating West Germany in that, and yet if you look at the flags that are being waved in the stadium, most of them are the Union Jack, right? Very few St. George's crosses. So this gives you an idea of just how totally, yeah, like kind of like English nationalism was subsumed by this greater British nationalism. And of course, Britishness has always been tied up with this idea of imperialism, right? And the oldest imperial project of the British were in Ireland. So obviously, for many hundreds of years, the English had played a part in conquering different parts of Ireland, and under Henry VIII, you end up having the Lordship of Ireland, whereby the English king was basically the Lord of all of Ireland, and there are multiple different rebellions, which we don't have time to go into now, etc., etc. But the main thing with regard to the Stuarts is with the so-called plantations of Ireland, and the plantations in particular of the province of Ulster. Now, with the rest of Ireland, there was kind of a very light kind of plantation. You had kind of English landlords, most of which, you know, either rarely kind of actually lived in Ireland themselves, or like even if they were there, they weren't particularly active, and there weren't many of them. And obviously, you had like a large kind of Catholic population that lived there. But what was unique about the Ulster plantations was the large influx of Protestant settlers, yeah, mainly from the borderlands between England and Scotland, because the new king, James I, he wanted to unite Britain, and the best way to do that was to get the most rebellious people of that island and to put them in Northern Ireland, right? So these rebellious people were the kind of border raiders who lived between England and Scotland, and basically he kind of encouraged them to up and leave and settle in Ulster. So about half or slightly more than half of all the kind of Protestant settlers who ended up moving to Ulster were of Scottish descent. And obviously you'd had like some Scots who had lived there many, many years before, because obviously like Scotland and Northern Ireland are so close to each other. But by and large, what we can imagine is that if the two kingdoms had never been joined, if England and Scotland had never joined, then it's much more likely that the vast majority of those who would have settled in Ulster would have been English, because the plantation of Ulster began all the way back with Mary the First. And yes, it might have sped up a little bit with the Seymours instead of the Stuarts, but by and large, what one can think of is basically how the population of Northern Ireland, the Protestant population there, let's imagine, just for simplicity's sake, that at least half of those never end up living there. And that would mean that Northern Ireland today, which at the moment is like 50-50 between being Protestant and between being Catholic. Imagine now if it was only a quarter of that population being Protestant and the other 3/4 being Catholic. That would give a bit of an indication. And something to note as well is that most of the Scots who settled there were Presbyterians, and Presbyterians tend to be quite more fervent Protestants than the Anglicans and the Quakers who would have come from England. So that's something to really bear in mind, that much of the kind of conflict between Protestant and Catholic within Northern Ireland, a large part of it stems back from this thing here, as we covered in previous videos, so definitely check those out. But of course, this doesn't just affect what happens in Britain or in Ireland, right? Because a large part of America, right, their descendants were Scots-irish, or Ulster Scots. Now, the reason for this is because although many people had settled, from these kind of borderlands, to Northern Ireland, when they got there was still the imposition of like the English on them. So you had the Church of Ireland, which is essentially an Anglican church, and they also discriminated not just against Catholics, but also against Presbyterians and other Protestant sects. And so, fleeing religious persecution in Ireland, many of these people who had originally come to settle in Ireland, they end up going to the American colonies. And much of this migration stemmed from the fact that now these American colonies were no longer just English colonies, but were actually British colonies as such. And what we can see with this is a clear indication in the censuses which were taken. So if we look at the census of 1700, we can see that the ancestry of the people within the American colonies at the time was about 80% English. However, when we fast forward to 1775, so this is like the first year of the War of Independence, right? In 1775, the ancestry of the American colonists is just 49% English, and about 14% of them Scots. Whereas if you compare it to what it was in 1700, it was just 3% of the total was Scots. So that shows that with this kind of act of union and with the merging of the English and the Scottish crowns, you end up having much more freedom for the Scots to be able to migrate to what had previously been English colonies. And something to note also as well is that the Scots-Irish were, these are people who mainly settled in the kind of the Appalachian region, and these were many of the people who end up eventually becoming the so-called rednecks and the hillbillies, etc. So these people here, who kind of were generally poorer, right, they tend to be a lot more rebellious, a lot more independently minded, and because they had been used to kind of like resisting English kind of oppression like at home, when it came to America, these were some of the most fervent people for American independence. So a big part of where America gets its fighting spirit from, is kind of like frontier mentality, etc., comes from these Scots-Irish, comes from these Ulster Scots, comes from these people who came from Scotland as a result of the Act of Union with England. And therefore, one can imagine that while there may well have been a war for independence, for the American colonies, it would have been much less, arguably, had this not been the case. And therefore, the American colonies in 1775 might very well have been far more English than they end up being by that time anyway. And also as well, if we look at the data from 1776, when we break it down by region, so New England, right, those of English ancestry there was about 70%. When we look at the kind of middle states, so Pennsylvania and etc., these states here tend to be about 41% English ancestry, because obviously you had many people coming from Germany, coming from Holland and all these other places, right? And then when we look at the south, it's just 37%. And the reason for that is obviously twofold. First of all, because the large number of slaves who came from Africa, obviously, and also as a result of many of these Scots-Irish here. So again, these states here tend to be the most rebellious. These states tend to be the ones which wanted the American colonies to split away. And so again, we can see the influence of the decision on, both like British history and also American history as well. And this doesn't just apply just to the American colonies. A large number of people, if one was to look at the British diaspora, right, a large number of people who came from like the rest of the empire, whether it's Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., etc. Many of these people were disproportionately of Scottish descent. And the reason being is because when you had settlers, right, they tend to come from the kind of Celtic fringe, yes. They tend to come from like the poorer parts of the British Isles. So that's why you had many Scots, why you had many Irish and stuff flee into the different parts. So again, there's this thing where if the British Empire wasn't really British Empire, if it was essentially an English empire kept completely separate from the Scots, then the huge influx of Scottish migrants who went to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., would have been much less, and therefore the character of these countries would be very much changed even to the present day. So that explains how such a union would have affected things on like a global scale. But how would it have affected England itself? So we've already spoken about English nationalism and how like the real sense of itself was forged in this kind of Elizabethan era, right? So we can imagine a continuation of that had the Seymours taken over after the Tudors as opposed to the Stuarts taken over after the Tudors. But there is the fact that obviously for some of this it's difficult to say what might have happened in spite of circumstances or not. Because for instance, if we look at the King James Bible, that was obviously pushed forward by King James himself, obviously, and that was trying to get like the Bible written in English. However, something to note is obviously this wasn't the first time the Bible had been written in English, and I see it as very unlikely that at some point there wouldn't have been some sort of Bible like that would be standardized and written in English, right? So yeah, you can kind of point to that, but to a limited extent. And the same thing as well with like the kind of like witch burners and stuff, all the kind of like fear about like sorcery and stuff that was happening at the time. Again, that was kind of the kind of culture at the time. So yes, James I did play a big part in that, but again, it's difficult to see what would have been completely different had the Seymours taken over instead of the Stuarts. And also as well, I think the main thing that the Stuarts kind of did that I think would have been different compared to the Seymours or any other kind of like English family, right, is the idea of absolutism, this idea of the divine right of kings. So first of all, we can see this with James I, who's a big proponent of the kind of divine right of kings. But we see this even more so in his son Charles I. And so a big part of the English Civil War is this conflict between the power of the king versus the power of Parliament, right? So so this is where Charles I eventually ends up having his head cut off, and then you end up having the rule of Oliver Cromwell, etc. And so all of this is kind of tied up with this thing of the conflict between the aristocracy and the monarchy, right? So the rights of the people end up being more and more kind of entrenched as a result of opposition to Stuart absolutism. And we can see this again with his son, James II, right? So he ends up taking over. He's a Catholic, right? And obviously this is a time at which, the English people have become very much Protestant, right? And this ends up leading to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where it ends up being the overthrow of that king and ends up being the entrenchment of this Protestant ascendancy, right? So you can see this in the English Bill of Rights in 1689, and then eventually with the Battle of the Boyne, which ends up crushing the Catholic King James in Ireland, is in 1690, right? So during this period here, you have the consolidation of the rights of English people and like liberties of English people, and basically asserting that there will never be absolutism and there will never be control. Well, from the way they say it, there will never be control from the Pope, i.e. like this kind of Catholic influence and stuff. So the English Bill of Rights ends up being a great precursor for the American Bill of Rights, right? And a large part of the American Constitution stems from this. So many of the ideas that eventually end up like influencing much of this kind of like liberal worldview, right, stemmed greatly from this conflict between the English people and this Stuart absolutism. So the question is, would there have been a need for this thing? Because if the Seymours or some other dynasty had taken over, would they have just accepted these things and there would never have had to been this conflict? But then if there had never been this conflict, would these beliefs and would these values have been as greatly entrenched as they otherwise were? So this is the kind of thing, yeah, where like with these alternative histories, as I've tried to point out throughout the long time that I've been doing them, there's obviously so many different factors that kind of come into play here, right? And I hope that through the covering of all the different alternative history scenarios that I've done, all the way back to when I first started it, right? I hope that it's given one an appreciation of just how complex history can be and just how important it is to understand the significance of an event or the significance of a process. Because if things had gone differently, so many butterfly effects, so many ripple effects, etc., would have gone through the centuries. And so that's why I've kind of covered these things in such a way. And I've tried to explain a large part of the history surrounding each event so that one understands it in its entirety. So rather than just kind of being like, oh, if this gone different and the world map would be like this and blah, 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 etc., as some alternative history channels do, I've tried to look at it through the lens of like pure history and trying to understand the significance of each historical event. So it kind of brings me with great pleasure, but also a great feeling of regret in a way that I couldn't think of any more kind of alternative history things to kind of cover through. But I think that I've done my fair share of this, and so now we are finally, I know I've been saying this since the end of last year, we're going to be moving on to film reviews, right? So next video is going to be explaining the kind of like setup for how we're going to be talking about the different film reviews things, and then from then on we're going to just be diving straight into that. And yeah, I really thank you everyone for who's come along for the journey, even if you come like halfway or you come right from the beginning. But it's been a real, it's been a real blessing basically. And yeah, let's keep the good times rolling basically. And that being said, have a great day and bye. And also, whoa, hold on. Don't forget to obviously hit the like button, subscribe, share with people as well. Don't forget sharing is caring. And yeah, anyway, take care now. Bye.